without further ado, I want to hand over to Francesca, Stella and Rebecca Kay from Glasgow University, and they are going to talk about their key findings and recommendations from a project that they have worked on, Language Learning and Migrant Integration in Scotland, Exploring Infrastructure Provision and Experiences 2019 to 2022. Francesca and Rebecca, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pauline. We're just going to share with you all the key findings and recommendations from our project. So in the project, we looked at the complex, we looked at the complex landscape of ESOL provision in Scotland through a comparison between Glasgow, Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City. And in doing so, we highlighted the diversity of ESOL, not only in terms of regional context, but also in terms of providers and learners. And we considered different perspectives in our project. So we looked at the perspective of ESOL providers and decision makers. We looked at the perspectives of teachers and community-based practitioners, and we looked at the perspective of learners. So one thing that I wanted to flag up at the beginning was that we circulated our key findings and recommendations ahead of the workshop. We hope you had a chance to read through them, but if not, not a problem, because we will go over them in this presentation. But what we would really like you to do is to give us your feedback and input on, particularly on our recommendations, because we are hoping that they can be put to some practical use. They can be used to lobby for, ESOL funding and so on. And so your input will be very valuable. So a little bit of background about our project. So the research project took place at a time when ESOL provision in Scotland was undergoing a lot of changes in terms of governance, funding, and organisation of provision. So we wanted to see how these changes impacted on provision. We also wanted to understand how well policy frameworks, funding priorities, and expected outcomes align with the experiences and understandings of ESOL providers and learners. So in Scotland, much like elsewhere in the UK, ESOL sits across different policy remits, notably education and migration. And in Scotland, this is further complicated by the fact that some policy areas are devolved and some are reserved to Westminster. So ESOL falls under the education remit, which is devolved, but the ESOL landscape is shaped in fundamental ways by migration policies, which are reserved to Westminster. And obviously, ESOL learners are subject to UK government rules over immigration, residency, and citizenship. So UK immigration policies, as you, I'm sure, are well aware, have become increasingly restrictive over the past 20 years. So we only need to look at the hostile environment, the ongoing changes to the asylum system, the introduction of a point-based immigration system, Brexit, and so on. However, the Scottish Government has consistently expressed a more positive attitude towards immigration, which has been widely seen as a solution to Scotland's demographic challenges and its economic and social ramifications. And this has arguably resulted in a different prioritising of ESOL. So as Pauline and Steve already mentioned, until recently, Scotland had a dedicated ESOL strategy. But over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been very significant changes in terms of ESOL governance. First, there were changes in funding mechanisms for funds allocated to the Scottish Funding Council. And around the same time, there was the demise of an additional ring-fenced strategic budget linked to the ESOL strategy. The Scotland ESOL strategy was not renewed in 2020, but instead it was subsumed into a broader adult learning strategy. And as already mentioned, in this new strategy has committed to produce recommendations on the next steps of ESOL based on a review of the impact of the latest Scotland ESOL strategy. but ESOL remains currently in a bit of a policy vacuum. And so what we are seeing is a deprioritization of ESOL at policy level, similar to what we have seen in other parts of the UK, notably England. And so we see a lot of issues that are cut across, that are hold true across the border. So stuff around unmet demand, underfunding, and lack of a short-term vision for ESOL. And we are already seeing the effect of this vacuum, policy vacuum around ESOL, around funding and related capacity, and also around effective coordination of resources. So I mentioned that one of the things that our project has highlighted very strongly is the diversity of ESOL. And this is something that is often overlooked at policy level. So there are three aspects to this diversity. First of all, the diversity of learners, the diversity of providers, and the diversity of regional and urban-rural context. So the ESOL sector caters for a very diverse group of learners in terms of migrant status, but also socioeconomic background, educational background, as well as gender, race, and ethnicity. And ESOL provision on the ground has often developed organically in response to the arrival of different groups of new migrants. And in Scotland, within our locations where we did our fieldwork, our ESOL learners had a very different profile. So in Glasgow, the majority of ESOL learners are asylum seekers and refugees. And this reflects the fact that until recently, Glasgow was the only local authority in Scotland to take in asylum seekers through UK government's dispersal scheme. But demand for ESOL tuition in Glasgow also exists among voluntary migrants and settled communities. In Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City, the majority of ESOL learners were voluntary migrants, particularly migrants from economic migrants from Central and Eastern Europe, and as well as migrants from other parts of the EU and further afield. Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City were also home to a relatively small number of displaced Syrian refugees who had been resettled through UK government's relocation scheme. So the situation has changed over the last couple of years with the resettlement of Afghan and Ukrainian refugees. We also wanted to highlight the diversity of providers. So ESOL classes in Scotland are organised and delivered by a range of providers, including further education colleges, local authorities through local CLD units, as well as voluntary sector organisations. And traditionally, provision in Scotland has been based around a division of labour between further education colleges and community providers. So typically, further education colleges provided SQA accredited classes and more intensive tuition based on a set national curriculum, whereas community providers generally offer non-accredited, less intensive classes in the community based on a social practice model. Finally, we wanted to highlight the diversity of regional context. So ESOL provision looks very different across different regions of Scotland. In Glasgow, there is a particularly complex and varied ESOL landscape, and potentially learners in Glasgow have access to a wide range of classes from 3 further education colleges and many community providers. But the reality is that demand far outstrips supplies, and some learners have to wait for a very, very long time to get a place. In Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City, further education colleges are available through the North East Scotland College, but only at its Fraserburgh and Aberdeen campuses. Community provision was available in a wider range of locations, but accessing classes remains a challenge, particularly for learners in more remote and sparsely populated areas. I just wanted to spend a few words on why we wanted to look at language learning and migrant integration. So as many have pointed out, including Mel, English language tuition for adult migrants is an area of education that is closely connected to policies around immigration control and citizenship, as well as migrant integration. We put the term integration in scare quotes because it is a contested concept that has been subjected to a lot of critique, for example, for being ideologically charged or ill-defined. But we still use the term integration for two reasons. So first of all is that this concept, this word remains ubiquitous in political and policy debates around migration, and efforts towards migrant integration are indeed mostly channeled through language training. So not just in the UK, but also in OECD countries, the bulk of government expenditure on immigrant integration is around language training. The other reason why we use integration is because we start from the position that it is useful to see language learning in the context of learners' wider lives and as part of a broader process of migrant settlement or integration, which encompasses economic, social, cultural, civic, and political dimensions. It should be noted, however, that integration policies in the UK and Scotland have traditionally targeted specific groups of migrants, and Scotland and the UK have integration policies that are focused exclusively on refugees, with no specific programs for migrants arriving through other routes. So moving on to our key findings. So I'm going to present some of our key findings and then hand over to Becca. So our first key finding is that we found very clear evidence of significant unmet demand. So this was particularly stark in Glasgow, where demands far outstrips supply. And so since 2016, Glasgow has had an ESOL register, which worked as a centralized waiting list for people looking for an ESOL class across the further education and community sectors. So at the beginning of 2021, there were around 12,000 people waiting for an ESOL class on the register. The figure rose to almost 18,000 at the beginning of 2022. And by way of comparison, in Rice and her colleagues' report produced in 2004, they reported a figure of 980 people on a waiting list in Glasgow for an ESOL class. And the other thing that we found is there was significant demand for both college and community classes. So most recently, the ESOL register has started to be used only to report interest in community classes. And the latest figure that I found, which is a bit different from Paulie's, but I think Paulie's is probably the most up-to-date one, is 6,800 people on a waiting list for community classes. We also found evidence in both Glasgow and Aberdeen City that third sector providers were stepping in to fill gaps in existing provision. And community providers indeed, because they work closely with migrant communities, seem better placed to gauge and flexibly respond to language needs compared to colleges. So this reflects a different approach to outreach and recruitment as well as to provision. So as one of our community providers in Aberdeen put it, our work is about reaching out to people who are not knocking on your door, rather than delivering to people who are coming through the system. In Aberdeenshire, a particular challenge was providing for smaller numbers of potential learners in more remote areas. And the changes to the FFC funding model established requirements for community classes around minimum number of learners and attendance that previously applied only to further education colleges. This made some classes in smaller rural communities completely unviable. So during the pandemic, most classes were moved online, and so geographical distance didn't matter so much anymore, because people could join a class that was actually physically based in Aberdeen. But there were mixed views among our participants about whether online or blended provision could be fruitfully used to meet the needs of learners in rural or remote areas, or indeed whether online provision could be the answer to growing unmet demand for ESOL. Our second key finding is around collaboration and partnership as key to local provision. So ESOL partnership in ESOL provision in Scotland has long been coordinated through community planning partnerships, and these local partnerships bring together further education colleges and community providers. And essentially, the partnership model asks providers to pull together their respective resources that sometimes come from different funding streams, and to plan and coordinate local provision according to their intelligence about where the need is. So traditionally, provision has been based around a division of labour, as I mentioned, between further education and community classes. And across our fieldwork location, partnership work was really essential in many different ways. So it was, for example, really important to gather and share information about unmet demand or the needs of specific cohorts of learners. And sometimes this generated new initiatives and collaborations. It was also really important in terms of, like, for example, testing learners and then allocating them to a class at an appropriate level. And it was important in terms of communicating and signposting ESOL provision locally and cross-referrals of learners to different providers. So we have in the report examples of effective collaboration and innovative work. And there seemed to be a general openness and goodwill among providers to make partnership works. But making these collaborations work was sometimes difficult, and it involved reconciling different approaches and agendas. One example of this is, again, the Glasgow ESOL register. So it was basically created to operate a single waiting list, but also coordinate local provision. And at the time when we did our fieldwork, most providers endorsed the general principle of joined up provision, but many pointed out that there were many problems with the ESOL register, that it was complicated and impractical for both learners and providers, and colleges in particular found the system not particularly useful. So one of our community providers described the ESOL register as an experiment worth trying, but in the end it was possible to continue the project in its original form. So from July 2022, it was decided that the ESOL register would only record interesting community classes while colleges would manage their own waiting lists. Our third finding is around the impact of funding uncertainties and stringent funding requirements on provision. So there are two different points here. The first is around the fact that different ESOL providers face different challenges and pressures around funding. So in the areas where we did our fieldwork, there didn't seem to be an immediate concern from colleges around funding. However, some of our participants also talked about, they wonder whether the deprioritization of ESOL at policy level may lead colleges to channel SFC funding into other popular subjects like childcare to the detriment of ESOL. Community providers face uncertainties around ESOL funding and capacity, often reflected limited or discontinuous funding. And across our field locations, third sector providers frequently stepped in to fill gaps in provision, but often they relied on ad hoc, short-term funding that resulted in piecemeal provision and was not conducive to a sustainable growth of ESOL. So something along those lines has already been mentioned by Sheila and Jody. The second point that we want to make is around funding requirements and how these can sometimes straitjacket provision and also create problems in partnerships. So particularly the changes in funding mechanisms around SFC seem very problematic in Aberdeenshire, where these changes were interpreted in a very restrictive way. So basically, the new funding model was understood to mean that for community providers, funding was conditional on delivering to the college credit model. And this included making most ESOL provision SQA accredited. So this created problems, and some community providers really felt that these requirements had straitjacketed community provision. And there were across the board mixed views around whether all learners sought accreditation or whether SQA accredited classes were appropriate for all learners, not only in Aberdeenshire, but also across all our fieldwork locations. And some third sector providers were very ambivalent towards this drive towards accreditation that was particularly stark in Aberdeenshire, but we also saw evidence of this to an extent in Glasgow. And some wonder whether this new emphasis on accredited classes as a standard and a standard curriculum actually could work with the social practice model that underpinned their work. So these issues around reporting requirements to funded and expected outcomes, for example, around accreditation and employability, and whether these are always aligned with providers' aims and learners' needs. So one question that emerged from our project is, what kind of outcomes can be meaningfully measured and how? And it seemed that numbers of learners, attendance and progression into educational employment may be easier to measure than other, no less important, but less tangible outcomes like improved confidence, well-being, and social connections. So I'm now going to hand over to Becca.
Thanks, thanks, Francesca. And I'm aware that we're rapidly running out of time, so I'll try and be quite quick with this part, but I don't want to be too quick because this brings us to the part of our report and recommendations which draw most strongly from the perspectives of the people most directly involved in ESOP as a learning process, the teachers, practitioners, volunteers, and ESOP learners themselves. And this first of the key findings that I want to highlight was about the emphasis that was put on placing learners' needs at the centre of policy and provision. And I think that chimes quite well with some of what we heard in the first panel. And this was something that really the majority of teachers, practitioners and volunteers we spoke to argued for very strongly. And they viewed ESOL as part of a much broader process of settlement for their learners, or we could describe that as integration, and something that had economic, social, cultural, civic and political dimensions. So you can see one example on the slide. I'm not going to read it out because of time, but this practitioner talking about ESOL as important not just for employability, but for being part of the community, for being able to speak to people, for being able to deal with institutions like schools, healthcare providers, and so on. And importantly, they reflected that this was the perspective on what ESOL was about that they got from their interactions with ESOL learners. This kind of perspective, as we've heard earlier today, fits quite well with some of the strategic objectives of Scotland's previous ESOL strategies. But the question is how to make it work and how to resource it in practice. So we think that also this kind of perspective shows the potential for joined up approaches to connect ESOL provision with wider initiatives and services and support for asylum seekers, refugees and migrants in Scotland. And we did find quite a lot of areas where practitioners and providers, especially those based in the community, were making these links, but sometimes in quite ad hoc ways and often relying very heavily on personal resources of time and enthusiasm, often only able to access quite short-term funding or only able to mobilize informal links rather than having some kind of more sustainable structural underpinning. And the result of this was that linkages were patchy, they were stronger in some places than others, and vulnerable perhaps in some of the ways that Sheila and Jodie were talking about, to not being able to be sustained for a whole variety of reasons. We also found some more formal providers then raising questions about whether these sorts of initiatives were really proper ESOL or not, and that seems to feed into the potential for fracturing and competition for resource. But for the most part, this holistic view of ESOL and its purposes and benefits aligned quite closely with what learners themselves told us about their motivations for improving their English and what they gained from their ESOL activities and classes. So Francesca, can we go to the next slide, please? So, as Francesca already said, a central question for our study was around diversity and the diversity of learners. And we looked at how, in particular, migrant status, urban rural location, and gender impacted on access to and experiences of ESOL. And we also saw how these could overlap with issues around educational background and social capital, as well as experiences of employment in Scotland, with issues around precarity and employment rights, but also around juggling employment with work, with other responsibilities, including family responsibilities. And there are, of course, all sorts of other aspects of diversity that we could have looked at and didn't. So just to begin with looking at learners' experiences of accessing ESOL classes and activities, how they found them and got signed up. And here again, the point that Francesca made about how location and migrant status overlapped in our study is significant. So in Glasgow, we spoke mainly with refugee and asylum seeker learners. And for most of these people, finding and enrolling in an ESOL class had been an early priority on arrival in Scotland and in Glasgow. But word of mouth had still been one of the most common routes for finding an ESOL class. And this is something noted in the study by Rice and her co-authors in 2004. And it can be a route that introduces quite a lot of inequalities within this particular subgroup. So we found that the newest arrivals and perhaps those whose status was most vulnerable or most precarious amongst asylum seekers were very dependent on other third sector organisations to signpost them towards ESOL provision. And all of the asylum seeker learners who we spoke to were in community-based classes, some of them also hoping to access college classes, but falling into that category of unmet demand. So Izad, who's on the slide, had been transferred to Glasgow from a reception centre on the south coast of England. He'd been in the city for less than 8 months when we spoke to him. Had joined community ESOL classes, which he attended twice a week and spoke very highly of, but was really keen to enrol for a more formal college course, but struggling to understand how he would do that. He found a website, he submitted his information, he wasn't sure it was the right website, and he'd been waiting a long time for a response. The people who we spoke to in Glasgow who were on college courses were most often in a more secure position. They had refugee status and better networks and access to information in the city. Many of them were women who'd come through family reunion routes and therefore had been joining family members who also already had refugee status and had been longer in the city. And Nafisa was an example of this. She arrived in Glasgow just before the start of lockdown, joining her husband through a family reunion group, and had managed to register directly for ESOL classes at a local college with the help of a social worker, but also with knowledge through her informal networks about how this was done. Can we move to the next slide, please, Francesca? In Aberdeenshire, in contrast, all our participants were voluntary migrants, most of them economic migrants in low-paid and precarious employment. The majority had been living in Scotland for many years, managing with various degrees of confidence and competence in English. Most had found ESOL classes again through word of mouth, but almost all of them were having ESOL classes around demanding timetables of shift work and family responsibilities. And this meant that for many of them, ESOL learning hadn't been an immediate priority, and some had only started ESOL classes after living and working in the UK for several years. And Justina, who's on the slide there, as an example, a single mother and sole earner family, she was juggling her need to take on demanding and physically intensive work with looking after her two school-age children. And so she said that she really hadn't been able to even think about ESOL to begin with. She did, however, prioritise it. She'd moved to Scotland specifically in order to take up an opportunity for a full-time college course with a fee waiver that she hadn't been able to access in England. And when she did begin classes, she continued to work evening and night shifts, finishing college at 4 and starting a shift at 4:30, which she said was definitely not easy. Across Glasgow and Aberdeenshire, then, family responsibilities, especially for women with young children, could delay or interrupt access to ESOL classes. And in Aberdeenshire, another significant set of barriers were around accessing ESOL across longer distances, especially for those in smaller towns and villages, as well as financial considerations linked to the cost of travel, as well as to fees for college courses. If we could move to the next slide, please. Diverse learners also bring diverse needs, motivations, and aspirations to ESOL spaces. And we did find that work and improving employment prospects were a strong motivation for both voluntary migrants and asylum seeker and refugee learners. However, migrant status nuanced learners' experiences, not least because it determined the opportunities they had for employment. So whilst on the one hand, none of the asylum seeker or refugee learners in our study had experienced work in the UK, and for understandable and good reasons, given that for the asylum seekers, at least they had very restricted rights to work, and they and most of the refugees that we spoke to had arrived quite recently, and many were women with young children. But for them, learning English was seen both externally by the system and from their own perspectives often as a prerequisite to being employable. And yet, for our other group of learners, mainly voluntary migrants, many of them EU nationals having moved when there was still free movement, the reality was that they'd often been able to enter the workforce irrespective of their level of English. So it wasn't English that made one employable per se, but it might be English that allowed one to escape a trap of precarious, low-paid work, which was where most of the economic migrant learners we spoke to were situated. For both groups then, educational backgrounds and social capital informed their aspirations for the future. Those with professional backgrounds often hoped that ESOL learning would lead to good professional jobs well matched to their experiences, and Soraya on the slide was an example of this. Whilst those with limited formal education in their country of origin had much more vague aspirations in relation to their future employment or education, and were perhaps less clear about how to navigate a variety of ESOL activities, volunteering opportunities, and so on, or what doing so might or might not mean for them in terms of employment prospects. Can we move to the next slide, please? As I've already mentioned, many of the voluntary migrants we spoke to had quite extensive experience of precarious and low-paid work, and they often regarded ESOL learning as a key component in improving their employment prospects. Some of these learners, especially those who've been in Scotland for several years already, had progressed their careers and did see ESOL as an important aspect of this. However, others had found that English was not all that they needed, and that other difficulties around recognition of qualifications, structural inequalities linked to age, gender, education, and ethnicity all came into play. ESOL, however, was very significant to their abilities to assert their employment rights and a sense of empowerment in work contexts. And Justina, again, was a really good example of this, and she spoke at some length about how she'd been convinced by seeing the dominance of her employer when dealing with a largely non-native speaking workforce, and his ability or the problems that her co-workers had to speak back against things that he was requiring of them, that really galvanized her to feel that I need to know English. She said, you have to know, you have to talk to people, you have to understand what people are saying, beside you, about you, or with you. And this was really key for her in this strong motivation to improve her English and to take a very proactive stance in negotiating with her employer around her employment rights. If you move to the next slide, please, Francesca. A majority of learners talked about their ESOL classes and activities as also providing opportunities to meet other people and having a positive effect on their feelings of social connectedness and mental well-being. And this is where we come back to the more intangible but really crucial roles that ESOL plays for people. So the importance of language classes as a site for sociability and support for general well-being was especially marked amongst forcibly displaced migrants, for whom language classes could be a real lifeline, where they were experiencing isolation in a new city and high levels of stress dealing with the asylum system. But we also found voluntary migrants making quite similar points, and perhaps especially so because we were conducting our fieldwork during lockdown, but also more generally about feelings of solidarity, about not being alone with issues, not feeling isolated in the face, for example, of negative rhetoric about migrants and migration. So Krzysztof on the slide was an older man from Poland who spoke really poignantly about the opportunities he felt he got from attending a mix of ESOL classes and language cafes, and no longer feeling alone with the problems or issues that he was facing. Several learners who'd arrived in Scotland with already strong English, in fact, joined ESOL classes as a way to increase their social connections and gain confidence in communicating with other people. ESOL classes and activities were described as a source of solidarity and support networks, both with other learners and with teachers or volunteers. And these connections could have practical implications, improving access to information about institutions and day-to-day life in Scotland, as well as increasing people's self-confidence in ways that were linked to being independent in their access to services and rights. So Soraya on the slide was quite typical in talking about how important it was to be able to deal with what she called her day-to-day work and of everyday bureaucracy and interactions, for example, with her daughter's school. Being able to deal with formalities linked to their migration status, but also with healthcare professionals, utility companies, schools, and other institutions without relying on others for help was important to almost all our learners, regardless of their migrant status, gender, length of stay, or even language ability. And this again was one of the things that people who actually seemed very fluent in English said was really important that they'd got from attending their ESOL activities. So I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Francesca just to quickly outline the final recommendations that we would like to be a focus of discussion in the breakout groups.
Thanks, Becca. So I just wanted to remind you all of our the recommendations that we sent out in advance of our workshop, and which are a nice way to conclude our presentation. So we are like our research findings, because these recommendations really follow on from our findings. So the first recommendation is for our new and comprehensive math bean exercise to scope demand for and provision of ESOL in Scotland. So our project was limited to 3 local authorities, but we don't know what's going on in the other local authorities in Scotland. And the last review of this kind that was undertaken in 2004 and fed into the first Scotland ESOL strategy. So this seems like a timely moment to do more of this work, to kind of scope provision and also demand, keeping in mind potentially new learner groups who are arriving or are likely to arrive in Scotland. Our second recommendation is around the need for a long-term strategic vision for the sector. So we have spoken about how at the moment there's a bit of a policy vacuum around ESOL, and we think that what should happen is that within this broader older learning strategy, there should be a dedicated drop-down ESOL strategy at the very least to give direction to the sector. And finally, our third recommendation is around that joined-up approach to ESOL that reflects diverse learners' needs and also facilitates coordination across ESOL providers and with other services supporting migrants. So we have spoken about how often it is third sector organizations that have more of a feel for needs of particular cohorts and are better able to respond to those needs. But obviously, this joined-up approach would also require joined-up thinking across ESOL and also other policy areas such as migration policies, integration and community development. So these are our recommendations. So we really hope that you are able to stay on for the continuation of our workshop, where you will be split into different breakout rooms, and we are seeking in particular your feedback for these recommendations. So we very much welcome any suggestions about how to improve them. We want to know if they resonate with your experience and your insights around ESOL. And basically any suggestions or anything that is missing from them, we would very much welcome them so we can then finalize them. And someone already has asked this question, the question in the chat about whether our findings are available. So we have written a report that will be circulated in May, which and by that time we will also hope to finalize the recommendations. So over to Erdem, or actually over to Pauline. I don't know if we actually have much time for questions.
No, not at all. I've been watching the time flicking away there. I